and we'll send that round for you to look at later. Okay, definitely over to you then, Martyna.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. So my name is Martyna, and I call myself now a horticultural consultant, but that's kind of come out from a variety of things I've done over the last 5-6 years now, starting from only knowing how to grow lettuce in a little pot on my balcony, and then moving to Hebden Bridge, where I'm currently at the minute, and then discovering incredible edible Todmorden. Not sure if you've heard about Incredible Edible Todmorden, but it's a volunteer group that plants vegetables, edibles around the town in public spaces, in visible public spaces. And mostly they are meeting, they're meeting every 2 weeks, and it's all about social gardening and social connection, which I will mention later on in my presentation. But through meeting Mary Clear and a lot of people who are in Todd, I've managed to get to a place called Incredible Aqua Garden, which is now closed, but it was a social enterprise that was teaching children primarily, but also older humans, about live soil growing, hydroponics and aquaponics, the latter two, which are urban farming methods. And from there, I've kind of moved on more into learning about soil. At the minute, I'm doing a course in the regenerative soil, which is basically how to remediate soils, because a lot of the soils in the world are being depleted. And then I think the background in hydroponics allowed me to learn about chemistry of soils and actually understanding the processes within it, and then what, you know, how we as humans affect it when we add to it or take away from it. So it was a really good introduction to kind of the hardware way of what's in the chemistry of soil and then how it works, to where I am now, to understanding these processes, but also with the newest innovations of, you know, crazy expensive microscope and different lights. You know, we can now look what's actually inside the soil. So we have physical data to count these microorganisms and to see the damage that we potentially might be doing, or to see the regeneration that we can also be doing. So what I'll do, I've prepared a 12 slide page presentation for you. So we'll go through it, and then I'd like to take some questions, or maybe, you know, I want you to lead me what questions you want to ask and what you want to know more about. So I'm happy to then come back to certain slides and then discuss things in a bit more detail. So let's see if I can share that. I think that's the one. Okay. Is that visible okay for everyone?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So starting from the kind of British climate, because it's obvious that we need to look at some ways that in the way that climate works. There we go. So British climate is characterized by relatively cool summers and mild winters. And as we all know, rainfall is distributed kind of evenly across the country, maybe more so where you guys are and more so where I am in Yorkshire, maybe less so down south. Western areas, because of the Pennines, so this whole area here, they usually get a little bit more. And it's known for its changeable and unpredictable weather patterns, frequent spells of rain, sunshine occurring on short periods. And then, as you see in the slide there has been some changes over the last few years, over the last 5 years really. Increased temperatures, which obviously we felt with our heat waves. Some years now we've had record-breaking heat waves. There was an occurrence maybe 3 or 4 years ago when there was 19 degrees Celsius in February, which was just, you know, unmet before. And then warmer temperatures, obviously, they can impact various aspects of gardening, including plant growth and our water management. We have changing rainfall patterns over the last few years. So a lot more fluctuations. So we have a lot more intense rainfall now, and more frequent extreme weather such as storms and heavy downpours. So the way this will influence the soil on which we're trying to grow, so the moisture levels will be different, the drainage will be impacted, and potentially toxicity can also be introduced to it. So Hebden Bridge here, I'm actually sitting in my friend's house, to use the correct, good bandwidth internet, looking over the canal and the river. And I remember when this river was maybe 100 meters from here, it was up to my chin if I were to stand on the street. So obviously a lot of these kind of flooding events will be bringing a lot of toxicity. Sewage will be bringing up and then contaminating soil. And obviously the availability of water for plants, when plants are submerged for a longer period, they also suffer because they do need oxygen to grow properly. We have now more seasonal variability. So our unusual weather patterns, such as mild winters and early springs, they might be leading into shift of the time of planting and growing and harvesting. I found that pretty much over the last 3 years quite intense, because either we had, during 2020, we had really hot April, then kind of cold, there was a snap of cold, and then it was really hot. Then 21, it was a very cold, long, rainy winter where I was, spring, and then it was very hot straight away. So we went from kind of saturated soil to the drought, which where I am, and I'm not sure what the soil is like around Settle, we are on a heavily clay area. So that soil is actually holding a lot of water, but then when it gives it away, it cracks. So it's not ideal, really. And then, yeah, we have, obviously that also leads to biodiversity changes. So with early spring, we will have a lot of pollinators maybe coming up, bees waking up from this hibernation early, trying to pollinate flowers. Then if there's a spell of kind of cold, they might have not had enough storage for survival. Another problem with this might be if we have late frosts and we have our fruiting trees and shrubs which produce flowers and produce fruit, that then might be affected because of the late frosts. Yeah, and then we have also increased the frequency of drought. So just last year, it's actually really interesting to me, this whole drought situation, because a year and a half ago, I wrote an article about gardening in the rain. There's a, what's it called? There's an organic farm here on the top of the moor, kind of halfway between Burnley and Hebden Bridge. And Will, the grower there, he grows in a very rainy climate. He's actually made ditches and moved the water away from his land and built the soil eventually. And I was writing about him, how is it to garden in a wet climate where there's obviously a lot of slugs, a lot of dampness and so on. And then last year, I had to write another article, which was kind of reflecting on what's happening in the UK at the minute, which was the extreme heat waves. It was 36.6 in the shade here where I was, and I've started seeing, significant changes. So my grapevine suffered, and it started self-pruning towards the end of the vine. The fruit was dropping. I was effectively growing a little bit of raisins in there. They never really became sweet, so they're just really wrinkly and sour. I've noticed my apple tree would lose a lot of fruit early, and it would self-prune some of the top parts of its branches. So we need to start thinking really about this, all of the other things that they're important, but I think for us as gardeners, the water availability for gardens is important. One of my clients' garden is fed by spring water, which obviously with prolonged periods of kind of dryness, that dries out. We've now started reassessing how can we, how much actually can we plant, because she's got quite a big garden and we kind of added a bed here and another bed there. We're coming to the point where we're kind of starting to think, well, this is the capacity at which you can actually water and keep everything healthy at the minute. So that's going to be something that people will have to think about when it comes to the future gardening projects. And then we have predicted changes for the next 3 years. I've done a very good job here in paint, which is mostly where I do all my pictures, maybe 2000, who knows what year. We have warmer temperatures coming. This winter was very mild. Personally, I've noticed just absolute hundreds and hundreds of slug eggs because the mild winter just doesn't, they kind of prefer that kind of temperatures. And then more heat waves. Obviously, we're going to have, well, actually, now we are on what, June. It hasn't actually properly rained here for 2 months. And by properly, I mean, a big long downpour, which would nourish the soil deeply. We've had a couple of spells of showers, but we've not had a proper good rain for 2 months now. And we start feeling it, we start seeing it. Again, now the soft fruit is producing the fruit. So I've noticed there's a lot of aphids everywhere on top leaves and top kind of buds of shrubs, because the plant is dry, it suffers, it attracts aphids, they drink the sap, everything is sticky. I don't know if you've noticed, maybe if you park your car under a tree, loads of trees have got really sticky sap underneath it now. So that's a direct result of really dry spell already now in April, May and June. Our climate is here actually characterized by a Gulf Stream, which goes somewhere around there, basically next to Ireland and north of Scotland. So this is where we have a lot of our rain and wind and kind of cast the spells. So when it comes to climate change, at first I thought, oh, well, we're just going to become the new Spain. So we're going to have the nice summers and, mild winters, and it's all going to be great. But actually it turns out that the Gulf Stream might affect us in a slightly different way. We might have more cloud cover, which I don't know if it's confirmation bias, but it seemed to me like up until the last week, really in Yorkshire, we had a lot of grey kind of white sky days rather than blue sky days, which, plants kind of liked. But I think maybe if we're going to have a lot more cloud cover, that might affect our growing as well. We're going to have a little bit more altered weather patterns. So that's more storms and rain and drought locally. Changes in cloud cover, I already mentioned that with the Gulf Stream. And then the impacts on agriculture and gardening. Again, shift in growing seasons, that might not only impact us as gardeners at home, this will also impact the big producers down south, or the fields that produce our food, not only in Britain, but also in Spain. So when we might have food shortages because they will just supply a certain amount of people, it will not be able to travel further on. So basically, we need to encourage as many people as we can to grow their own, even if it's just supplementing your herbs, or, I'm not saying to grow all your dinners every day, but to have certain staples that you can rely on when there might be shortages in some sense. So when we look at traditional gardening practices that were pretty much introduced after the war, we've been doing a lot of excessive tilling. So double digging, when I started to learn how to grow, I was reading about double digging, and then pretty much luckily straight away I've come across the method of no dig, which is the opposite to it. When you break the soil, actually what happens, you change its structure. So all the life and worms and all these animals inside, they've made the tunnels, they've made lots of different pathways there through which the water sinks and kind of filters straight down to the ground, and tilling breaks that structure. Obviously then it damages the beneficial organisms, it damages their kind of habitats, and also what digging does is actually release nitrogen from the soil. So when you break it, you release nitrogen, and then your soil, as it starts being depleted, then needs more nitrogen. That's why obviously post-war, a lot of fertilizers, here it says overusing chemical fertilizers, but the word chemical, water is chemical, kind of everything is chemical. They are mineral fertilizers. So when we look at mineral fertilizers, actually nitrogen, so we all know that nitrogen is something that our plants like. So we have nitric acid? I can't remember what was the chemical term, but if you remember the huge explosion in the port of Beirut, where you know, the cloud was like this versus the port like this. That was essentially nitrogen that was stored on the boat, and it made a big boom. So if you actually look into the history of chemical fertilizers, it appeared after the war that when humans decided to not do a lot of big booms around, you know, Europe and the world, they had a lot of, you know, chemical left. And what they figured out that actually this chemical is quite useful in agriculture. So like in America, and America is a good example to look at first, because they've actually depleted their soils a lot worse than we did by fertilizing. And if you read a little bit about the Dust Bowl effect, where essentially the topsoil was so eroded, it was just kind of swirling in the air and you know, and killing everything and making people, you know, lose their crops, lose their farms. It was all because of the overuse of chemical fertilizers. So they create a massive imbalance in nutrients in soil. They acidify it, so then, you know, we need to keep adding more, and then we need to put the next thing, so that our reliance on synthetic sides, so herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, all of these things, because as our plants are struggling, we have to give them protection, you know, and it is really now with laboratory equipment, with all of the data coming out from, you know, from scientists who are not being paid by Monsanto to produce certain reports saying how amazing is Roundup. Now we have the data, and there's a big movement, particularly in the last 2 years. I've noticed a huge movement into live soil, starting from America, but also now quite broad in the UK. There's people doing beautiful things, you know, with rejuvenating soil, and then the data is there, so it's only for us to look at. One of the other practices that we've been ignoring soil health and fertility, so lack of crop rotation. There might have been some crop rotation amongst small gardeners like us. We would have a maybe 5-year crop rotation, which would be good. But big monocultures, you know, the big farms that actually are producing the vast amount of our food, they hardly ever would be doing that. So we've moved on to the big swathes. You know, for the commercial purpose, it's much easier to have one field of corn or wheat or something rather than multiple different crops on one land. And then covering soil is something that was, you know, traditionally practiced, because we would have green manures, we would be growing lupin or buckwheat, and then that kind of went out of fashion. We became a little bit more concerned about how our gardens look, and we like the look of, you know, black soil without any weeds, tilled a little bit and fluffy. You know, unfortunately, it's not that great, and covering soil is bringing lots and lots of benefits. I'm lucky to work with a school in Halifax, and we've covered all of our beds with cardboard over winter. And then in spring, I showed kids underneath the difference between some areas that we didn't cover and then the areas that we did cover. And it was teeming with worms, and it was teeming with beetles and lots of little soil creatures that we can barely see with a naked eye. And then what that tells us is when they're there, the smaller guys like bacteria and fungi are also there. So covering soil is a very important aspect that we've missed. And then poor water management. I mean, you know, in a country like England, it's hard not to kind of do a little bit of watering, because our water butts are usually full from all the rain. But, you know, that has kind of led to a lot of spraying, and I'm not even going to mention lawns, or if anybody's, you know, hydrating the lawns, maybe we need to look into different species that actually can withstand a little bit more drought, like clover. So hopefully these things will soon be a real thing of the past. And then I'll leave this on the screen, and you can kind of read or take a screenshot later. But living soil is something. It kind of is. If you think about the forest, you know, when did we see a flood in the forest? Hardly ever, really, because forest floor is like a big sponge. There's lots of worms, there's lots of various different microorganisms there. which are breaking down the leaf matter and breaking down the roots and kind of, you know, and breaking down the poo that the bird might kind of drop on the floor. So it's actually, this whole thing is called the soil food web. And just like we have a chain of kind of food webbing where we are, so, you know, a worm, and then the bird will eat the worm, and then something bigger bird will eat the bird, and so on and so on. The same thing happens actually in soil. So we have lots of different animals in there who are breaking down the nutrients. They work together with the plants. So actually, plant, as it photosynthesizes from, you know, it takes the energy from the sun, it turns it into sugar, and then these sugars, some of these sugars are used to help the plant grow, and some of them, they go into the root zone of this plant as something called root exudates. So essentially, it's like this little goo that comes out at the end of the root, like a sugar solution, like a syrup, which attracts a lot of bacteria and a lot of fungi, because that's what they feed on. Since we have a lot of big bacteria and the fungi in this area, now we're going to have a worm or a nematode or another kind of higher up in the web animals. So even if you kind of think about empty ground where you might have just one or two plants, like maybe in some bare soil, if you pull the clump of grass from there, if there's going to be worms anywhere in the soil, it's going to be around the root zone of this plant, because that's where all of these bacteria are. So one of the things that you could do, and it's kind of highly encouraged by Charles Dowding and his no-dig method, is when you harvest your vegetable, like for example, a cauliflower, rather than pulling the whole plant from the ground, you just snip it, lob it at the bottom of, at the soil level, and then you harvest your broccoli, and you leave that root full of this, exudates, full of all these bacteria. You leave it in the ground because it will just disintegrate and actually feed your bed as it is, rather than putting it in the compost and then waiting a year till it breaks down, or worse, even taking it to the municipal tip or anything like this. So soil food web, I'm not going to talk loads about it here, but there's towards the end I have a slide where you can have a look at the Soil Food Web School. I highly recommend Dr. Elaine Ingham, who has been studying this since the 70s, and she's an extremely interesting lady who has basically just shown a whole world to us as gardeners. And then this is kind of what some of those animals look like, or their role in the soil is. So part of the thing that's really important for us when it comes to climate change is the carbon storage. So if you think about carbon, what carbon we have in soil, so we have obviously the fossil fuels, which is all of these animals and dinosaurs and everything else in between them and us, which basically are a stable form of carbon. But also carbon can be stored in soil as live carbon. So if you imagine every one of those animals, they are made of carbon. We're all made of carbon. So if we had almost none of this and just had a little bit of predatory nematodes, there wouldn't be much live carbon in the soil. If our soil food web is rich and biodiverse, we are actually storing a lot more carbon within it. That's helping, obviously, to mitigate the CO2 levels, put them in soil. And then if we look at regenerative living soil practices, so this is a picture from a farm in America, and quite opposite to the monoculture fields, which are just beautiful, straight rows of sprayed plants. This is teeming with biodiversity. If you look at this kind of picture, you might think, oh, we will need a lot of watering. But actually, because we have that soil food web in place and all of these organisms work together, and then we have pollinators and all of the other kind of ecosystem on top, with time, gardens like this actually do need less water because the roots are a bit established, they're helping each other. We're having different plants that are supporting other ones next to them, whether it be for kind of avoiding pest attacks, or maybe feeding them, like the legumes do feed the soil. So I think Melanie and Sarah asked me to mention 3 top tips for kind of climate-friendly gardening. I think these 6 really are the thing that's the most important takeaway from my presentation. So mulching, obviously adding a layer of ideally organic matter. I mean, you can mulch with slate and all of that nasty stone, but if you mulch with something that is organic and actually breaks down, it helps you save water. It helps you obviously stop the weeds growing. So an interesting thing about weeds growing is if you always till your soil, even if it's just the top of it, and you pull the weeds, as you till, you might be bringing a lot more seeds that were in that soil, but they were too deep to come up. So now they're on the top. So you're still going to have these weeds. If you create a layer of mulch, you will only get the weeds, maybe some of the like docks and stuff that will come through, but you're going to get a lot less weeds that just kind of self-seed. Occasionally a bird might drop one, or a dandelion seed will fall in. But with time, as you change that whole environment, mulching is going to decrease your weeding needs. And obviously it's like a little blanket on top of soil, so it allows all the worms to get all the way to the top and then eat everything that's there without being afraid that it might dry out, or might be caught by a bird, or something will happen to it. The second thing is horticultural gardening. So this is a Dutch method which has is kind of imitating a fallen tree in the woods. So traditionally, horticulture beds would be in the shape of a mound on which you would lay big logs at the beginning, at the bottom of the bed, then smaller branches, and then sticks. So essentially make like a bed out of wood, quite a kind of raised bed out of wood. On top of it, you would put a layer of nitrogen-rich, for example, manure with worms. On top of it, you would put a layer of topsoil. So essentially what would be a raised bed, and most people just put topsoil on their own, or soil compost. Here you've got this big like storage of carbon, because wood is carbon dense, and then you have nitrogen and worms. So essentially it's like a big composting bed that has its own ecosystem, loads of air gaps for animals to travel through. Fungi develop excellent in these beds because fungi like wood chip, all that stuff. And then obviously mulch on top of your topsoil. And then when you plant your plant, it's still kind of in that topsoil area. And within a year, that whole thing starts to break down. And some of the horticulture beds, depending how deep you do the layer of the wood, you know, can be, you know, breaking down for 5 years, and you can actually grow trees in them as well. So it's one of the ways is basically feed your soil for 5 years, so you don't have to apply any fertilizer. You know, you have a healthy ecosystem within it. But also, what is really important in terms of climate and climate changing and too much water and not enough water, is because if you think about normal raised bed, as it rains, it'll get saturated to its, you know, maximum capacity, and then it will just have a runoff somewhere. Whereas if you have a hugel bed, wood and all of this material underneath it can actually soak a lot more water, like in the woods. So it'll soak a lot more water, and then when it's hot, naturally that water would want to evaporate. So from our raised bed, we're going to have an equal layer of evaporation and drying from the top. Whereas in hugel bed, once, because it's covered with your mulch, that water doesn't evaporate so fast, and actually your root zone is then having a really nice, moist and cool environment. Whilst it might be hot on the top and the plants are, you know, thriving because they like this, this is kind of preventing the roots and the animals, because it's the animals and that soil food web that's important to supporting the healthy roots of healthy plants. So horticulture gardening is something that is worth experimenting with. And I actually did it because not everybody wants to have big mounds and kind of big permaculture spaces. You can apply this to your raised bed. So every time I build a raised bed for a client, I will fill a third of it religiously with wood and wood chip and leaf and straw and kind of organic matter. And only 2/3 of it will be kind of mixed of different soils, aggregates, worms, and so on. If you only, for example, garden in pots, you can again imitate the same thing with pots. So maybe put a third of your pot with wood chip. And don't buy wood chip from B&M or any one of those colored barks. Just find a local tree surgeon, or maybe as an allotment association. Buy a big pile of wood chip, let it just sit somewhere in a corner and break down. And then in your pots, you put wood chip and then maybe some manure and then topsoil. And you'll find that, your plants are going to be a lot healthier this way. Composting, I don't think I need to explain a lot, because I'm pretty sure if you're all growing, you are composting. There's lots of different methods of composting. Obviously, most of us will be doing cold composting, which is just the windrow kind of methods, turning it maybe every few months. As we turn compost, obviously we add oxygen to it. That is what's actually activating the bacteria to kind of heat up again and break things down a little bit more. So it's worth turning every 3 months if you have possibility to do that. But also recently I got interested in thermophilic composting, which is a method used by quite a few people, mostly again in America, and those people who are practicing regenerative farming. There's a method called Johnson-Su bioreactor, invented by Mr. Johnson and his wife, whose surname is Su. So this method is essentially, if you imagine a pallet with 5 holes drilled into the top layer, and then into each of those holes there's a plastic PVC pipe inserted, like a long kind of tunnel. Around it there will be a chicken wire with some layer of like black fabric, maybe like the wheat stock fabric type of a thing. And then our compost, which will be in certain ratios, so it's a little bit more precise how many parts of nitrogen, how many parts of carbon you're adding, and so on. You mix it all up and you put it into this, in between the pipes, and you leave it for 3 days, and after that you take the pipes away, so you have kind of airing panels in there, and then you leave it for a certain amount of days, you break it down in a certain way, and then you assemble it so every part eventually ends in the middle. So it's really hot composting. It's a very high temperature of this. So it sounds a bit complicated, and it sounds a bit kind of, maybe we don't need it, but tests on these kind of composts have shown a far higher amount of fungi developing later, and a lot of different variability in bacteria. So that's the kind of stuff that we then can enrich our depleted soils with. And maybe, when we can test the soil now, we know what's missing, and we can create a bespoke compost that maybe will have more phosphorus or more potassium, because we've been growing kind of something that's been taking phosphorus or potassium from it. So there's different methods of composting, and I would say, composting is certainly one of the most important things that we can do for us, for climate. We can do leaf composting. So I did a shout out in my hometown in autumn, when we had a lot of leaf fall, the first week when all the leaves kind of fell with the winds. And we asked people to gather leaves from the driveways and lawns, because not everybody wants to have leaves on the lawn. Maybe leave them around in your borders and kind of certain areas so animals can overwinter. But if you have any driveway or somewhere where it gets slippery and dangerous, take these leaves away, put them in a pile, maybe make a communal big pile of leaf mold. And that later, once it's broken down, takes about 2 years, again with a couple of turns, is a very delicate and light compost, which then can be mixed with some of the other soil and sand, and you can have your own potting on compost, for seedlings and starting the seeds, because it's very low in nitrogen, so it's actually quite good to start seeds in. So various different composting methods, all of them equally important, including wormeries, and which are, so it's vermicomposting, and wormeries are a good way to particularly get kids into composting, because everybody loves worms, and I work now with humans aged 4 to kind of, you know, in the late 80s, and they're all, you know, the older ones, they know about worms, but the smaller ones, they absolutely love the wormeries, and they all want to hold the worm now. But vermicomposting is actually a really good way if you don't actually have a garden or space to compost. You can have a little box in the kitchen or in a garage or in a shed, and you can just throw your scraps in there, even if it's not all the food that you kind of have as a waste, but even something, then a handful of these worm castings might be a really good top feed for your pots or your beds or whatever method you're growing. The next one is anaerobic and aerobic compost teas. So again, I'm not sure how much you guys know about compost teas. So anaerobic tea is environment without oxygen. So if one of the first things I did, and a lot of people kind of start with it, is to have a nettle tea or a comfrey tea, which is basically chopped up nettles, young nettles full of nitrogen in spring when they come up before everything else come up. It's worth to harvest because they're full of nutrients, both for us as humans to eat as well, to have some nettle soup or something like that, delicious and really nutritious stuff, but also for our plants. So anaerobic, basically breaking down of this in water where there's no oxygen, break down the organic matter from the plant, release the nutrients and minerals into the liquid, and then as you strain it, you add fresh water, so you add oxygenated aerobic kind of water to it, because you're going to be putting this nutrient on your beds, which by this definition with living organisms in it, it's an aerobic environment. So you need to change your anaerobic to aerobic, then add it. So I have seen excellent results with comfrey tea particularly, whereas before I was growing a tomato with kind of one truss. As soon as I started feeding weekly with comfrey tea, that one truss then would have like 5 trusses equally full, full of tomatoes. So comfrey is full of potassium, and flowering plants and fruit producing plants love potassium. So comfrey is the most important plant in the garden for me, I think. You can actually even use it as a green mulch straight away. Green, most of the things you can mulch when you've just chopped it. Comfrey will happily, if you've got too much of it, just chop it, put it in compost or put it around your beds. You will retain some of the moisture. You can keep it as mulch. It's a fantastic plant. So that's kind of what a lot of people are doing already, whereas the aerobic compost teas, there's a slight more technique to doing it. So you take an aerobic compost, so you take basically, you reach to the bottom of your compost, you're ideally the oldest that you have, because the oldest compost will have more fungi than bacteria. Younger compost will have more bacteria. And then you essentially put it in a bucket of water, obviously non-chlorinated water. You add molasses, which is your source of sugars, which obviously, as we know, the soil food web animals, they need the sugars to live. So we add sugars, and then we add oxygen. So you can use a air pump like you use in a fish tank. So they're about 15 pounds, and you get an old bucket, 15 pounds worth of bubbling equipment, and then you put your compost in one of, the perfect thing for it is actually tights, ladies' tights, because they're quite porous and see-through, so you can put the compost into it, put the molasses into water if it's in a liquid form, into your pouch made of tight. You can put a little bit of, you can put a bit of manure, you can put anything really you want. The basic thing is the compost, rich compost, molasses and oxygen. And then you submerge your pouch of compost sock in your water with the sugar, and you turn the bubbler on. What happens now, because it's a highly oxygenated environment with lots of sugar, and these bacteria will just go, wow, we're just going to multiply. You do it for 12 to 24 hours, not longer, because by that point they're going to eat up all of the resources and start dying out. So 12 to 24 hours later, so you can do it overnight. If you say leaving the allotment, or you do it at home in your garden, you know, leave it overnight and water it in the morning. So you use that pretty much straight on your beds. So just, you know, whatever was in your compost is now multiplied in this liquid soup, and then you spread it. So this is one of the easiest methods to add life to your soil. And again, the results are incredible. If you look at American studies and in Australia as well, because obviously they're struggling a lot with drought. You know, these are the places that we, you know, English gardeners, we need to look at where, how are they dealing with the heat? How are they dealing with all of this stuff? And by using aerobic compost teas, you will boost the life in your soil, and all, like, you can visibly see your crops. So I've actually, one of the clients of mine, when we made a hugel bed in her polytunnel, so obviously polytunnels get hot in the summer, she's got pretty much still one kale growing from 2020, just chops it down at the bottom and then it sprouts and grows into vegetative form again. It doesn't flower. So kale and parsley, and every single thing in there is just huge and healthy, and it's almost like from a picture. So last year in August, I came across a real soil scientist. You know, these are the guys who sit all day in front of microscopes and count bacteria and fungi. And I took, well, I took my sample to him, which he said, oh, it's quite good. And I didn't even really look after the soil that I sampled. So I thought, okay, well, let's try this soil from my client's polytunnel and her compost. We sent 2 samples and they came out amazing. I've been told that the compost sample had a predatory nematode in it, because there's different types of nematodes. And a predatory nematode indicates a very healthy ecosystem, because it predates on the bad nematodes, which then cause diseases and so on and so on. So what we saw with our eyes, healthy plants, big green foliage, you know, loads of fruit, like everything was just pest resistant, really lovely stuff, and tasty, obviously. And my clients, you know, in the late 60s, they're never ill. They have no problems with their health. They've actually managed to not have COVID somehow. I don't know whether it's because of that or not, but overall the immune system has improved over the last 3 years since they've been eating actually live food. And I'll speak a little bit about live food towards the end of this. And then the last practice, cover crops, obviously I've mentioned before. So either obviously covering your beds and covering your ground with anything for winter, but cover crops, you know, growing them maybe kind of early autumn, letting them grow a bit, and then even covering that, let them break down, let these animals in soil eat whatever has been grown. And then this is the most mind-blowing statistics I have heard, actually, again, coming back from the studies of Americans. In the background, you can see a traditional monoculture farm field with pooling water and a lot of compaction, probably from tractors. If you look up at some videos of the soil food web, they talk a lot more there about how soil compaction affects the roots of the plants and their stability and health and so on. So as we know, the healthy soil biome promotes soil structure, organic matter accumulation, and microbial activity, all of which contribute to increased water holding capacity in soil. So by increasing your soil organic matter, which you can check if you do a soil sample, by increasing it by 1%, you can hold 20,000 more gallons of water per acre. So that's a lot of water per acre. If you think about, you know, instances of flooding and instances of drought, 20,000 gallons is quite a lot to be playing with. And again, looking at American studies, a lot of people there have the Savory, Allen Savory Institute. There's tons and tons of information. Also Africa, reversing desertification. So there's the most incredible group on Facebook, which I will recommend to you, called Soil for Climate, Soil #4 Climate, which is a bunch of people who are promoting rejuvenating soil, and they also have now over 10 years of experience of reversing desertification in Africa. And the guy there is called Seth Iskan. He has pictures of himself against, you know, a fairly dried bush and desert behind him. And then he's a picture 10 years later, and the semi-dried bush now is a tree, and everything around them is full of, you know, healthy plants and cows and pasture. So it is possible to reverse all the damage we have done so far with all of these things. And then a word on chemical fertilizers and soil health. I mean, we've kind of talked about it. So it creates the nutrient imbalance, acidifies the soil, reduces the soil organic matter, because, you know, if you add nitrogen to the soil, it's like a fast food for the plant. It will take that rather than work to take the atmospheric nitrogen that's been stored by other plants. And then obviously the other plants eventually are being eradicated. So we now rely on this. So soil organic matter is actually directly affected, even by stuff that, you know, we still use. That stuff still on shelves in a lot of gardening centers. Most of these things are not promoting anything organic. Well, the life in soil. And then let's see where we are. Yeah, so basically it's all about soil health, quite frankly. And then gardening with kindness and community. I like to put this word kindness here. You can see it on the picture behind a little bit. So this is a picture from incredible edible Todmorden, where religiously every 2 weeks volunteers meet and do, you know, be it winter, be it summer, be it hot or cold or rainy. And it has, you know, incredible edible Todmorden is an interesting study, because it's a movement that grew into over 800 groups in the world now. It has been kind of featured in many films, but it's a different group to any other incredible edible anywhere else in the world. And now what it has created such a strong social bond to the people of Todmorden. Many different examples, you know, people who were ill. I once went and saw a guy who I've never seen, and I don't go that often, but I kind of didn't see the guy. I asked him, "Oh, have you been coming here long?" And he said, "Oh yeah, for the last year I've been coming every week." And but at the beginning I wasn't, you know, very into it, because I actually spent 5 years in bed because I was so depressed, and I actually forgot almost how to speak. I didn't know how to use my mouth. So it was very difficult for me. And it was just by coming here and being allowed the space to, you know, maybe weed on my own in the corner, or carry some bags, or take some waste to the tip, or do some sewing of beds, and then being a little bit more social, it has had an incredible impact on his health, on his mental health, and many people. Sometimes I sit, you know, eating, because we always finish the thing with a meal, because there's nothing more bonding than eating together and chatting over the table, as obviously brought in a lot of cultures. You know, in France they still do it, and a lot of kind of back in the day we would sit to the table and eat and talk. And, you know, as a civilization we moved away from it, and we're more, you know, eating on the go and looking at our phones or watching TV. So we kind of lost that connection with food, and the connection is something really important. And I find that gardening, whether it's gardening or cooking or anything with people, this is how, you know, societies will, you know, deal with climate change. Because when climate change will happen, you know, in Settle or in Hebden Bridge or somewhere else, like we have the flood, we had to wait 3 days for the government to even do something. In 3 days, we had half the streets cleaned, because everybody just took brush and gloves, and, you know, it happens every 2 or 3 years, so we're kind of ready for it now. But as communities, we have to be together, and gardening is a really good way to kind of join all ages. You know, you can have babies who, you know, let them eat soil, let them put something in the mouth, because their gut biome, the whole immune system is getting accustomed to what's that. Obviously, don't give them anything that's been sprayed, but community and kindness is important. And if your community is strong, if you have good bonds, and you know that John can help Mary when she's moving house, or somebody can make food for somebody else when they're ill, this is really the essence. And, you know, it's through medium of gardening and through medium of kind of social action. But, you know, when we look at climate change, it will mean problems, and it's just it's important to be together and be honest and kind of supportive to each other, because then that way you're gonna, you're gonna manage. Well, we're gonna manage as a human civilization, really. And then a couple of words on gut health and food from living soils, because through growing. So when I started growing at the Incredible Aqua Garden, that was after maybe 7 years of working in restaurants, running restaurants. So my life basically was working evenings, eating pizza at 2 a.m. because everything was closed, and then maybe having a couple of beers, and then sleeping till late, and then getting up and going to work for 4. So you don't really cook because you don't want to eat, that early, and then at night you don't do it. So it's a cascade of bad life choices, which then made me end up with irritable bowel syndrome. So just as I moved to Hebden Bridge, it was causing me a lot of problems. Long story short, through my growing, for the aqua garden and then learning a little bit about it, I've learned also, and being Polish, we've been kind of fed sauerkraut since we were kids. I've learned that fermented foods actually help my IBS, and I actually got rid of it, didn't even know, but just by drinking kombucha in 2020, because everything was closed. So essentially I stopped eating my processed food, stopped going to the pub for a pint every day, and then pretty much was cooking at home what was available, and then eating fermented foods, and that's healed me. And then there's an incredible correlation about how we grow, the soil that we grow, what's in our vegetables, and then if we put that into our gut, obviously then we might, the key is, we might prevent an offset of certain diseases. So there's a big rise in Alzheimer's, diabetes, and lots of other diseases, eczema, psoriasis, lots of skin problems. Our autoimmune system as humans has been depleted for 100 years since we had, chemical fertilizers, more environmental factors like cars on roads and so on. A whole range of various additives in our food, which are just, completely unnecessary. And then forgetting foods like this, forgetting fermenting and so on. And it's really important to grow, to have healthy soil, to have healthy plants, and then to have healthy gut, because, probably we're all gonna get cancer or diabetes or Alzheimer's, but really we want to get it when we're in our, 80s, 90s, if we can, not in our 40s, 50s, because once that disease is offset, you have a period of time when it kind of, will ruin you. And, maybe when you're older, it's a little bit easier. You might not have children or anybody, we're just trying to prolong our well-being rather than kind of age, because it's important and we don't want to be sick. Okay, so as a last kind of summary thing, here I would say, for, something to think about, and then speak to your peers, speak to your neighbors, speak to your children about, maybe growing one plant, trying, because I think once somebody starts growing something, even if it's in the pot, even if it's not live soil in a hugel bed, just let them grow lettuce, let them pull that radish, that kid, and let them try it. That is what's going to ignite the kind of curiosity. I always say to my clients, it's addictive, so be careful. And they do come back with me, build another bed, and I've done this. So yeah, so make everybody addicted to this rather than all of the other nasty stuff that we as humans got addicted to so far. So I think that might be it for me. I'm happy to take some questions and elaborate on other things. And these are some interesting things that I recommend you have a look at when you have a bit more time.
Thank you so much, Martyna. Would you mind leaving your last slide on then? People can make a note.
Thank you.
Lovely, thank you so much. Lots and lots of very interesting and very easily applicable techniques, I would think. Have we got questions? And if you would mind if I just come around to hand you the mic so we can make sure everybody else hears. Any questions? Oh, hang on, sorry, just one. Sorry, back to, or we can clap if we can. Question from Joe.
I saw a short documentary recently which talked about biochar and biochar being used to really get bacteria and stuff in the soil really fast.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about that?
So what did you say, bioethanol?
Biochar, you know, like charcoal type stuff.
Oh, biochar, yes. So biochar, excellent question. I love that. Biochar is again one of my favorite things. So biochar, essentially, you know, when you have a fire in the allotment and you use your wood, so we're not talking about charcoal or anything that's been soaked with any petroleum stuff. So burnt. The process to create biochar, you have to go through a process of pyrolysis. So it's high temperature and no oxygen or little oxygen. So if you have high temperature and oxygen, something burns to ash. If you have high temperature and no oxygen, it pyrolyzes. So it changes the structure of this wood or plant. It could be any organic matter into a stable form of carbon. So that form of carbon so it's like a char. Essentially, if you've finished your fire and you put some water on it at the end because you're going home, you don't want it lit. Next day you come, you have this kind of crunchy wood with lots of porous holes in there. This is amazing to add to your compost. So just crumble it up and chuck it in your compost pile, because char on its own, it will eventually absorb the properties of environment it's in, so like the soil. But if you put it in compost or in comfrey tea, for example, you can charge it. So biochar is char, which is then charged with either solid stuff like compost over time, or you can actually make your comfrey tea and then you soak your biochar in it for a couple of weeks, I think. And then you can add that into your beds. So if you think about this structure with lots of tiny little porous little gaps, and we can't even see most of them. If you think about bacteria, which are really important in soil, they're eaten by, say, nematodes, which are slightly bigger. So this little brick of biochar is essentially like a housing estate for all these bacteria, and the nematodes can't get in there. So, so one of the good ways about biochar is that it has harbors bacteria, so it creates these little pockets in your soil that they can live and be safe from there. Also, biochar in mitigating climate change is great because it can hold 3 times its weight in water. So if you have 100 grams of char, that essentially can be 400 grams when it's soaked. So when it's too much water, it'll just soak it and hold it, and when it's not enough, then it will kind of give it out slowly. So yeah, so biochar is definitely, so pretty much the best way to do it, if you do it on a small scale, is if you have a fire at the allotment, some wood, and you kind of still keeping going. Every now and then, just get a little bit of that char away. And the perfect moment is if when you burn a log and you don't know if it's burned all the way through, just on the outside of it, when it starts to become a little bit gray, like with ash, that's when it's kind of charred all the way through and it's now burning to ash on the outside. So that's the perfect moment to kind of take it away and then cool it down in water, and then maybe add to your compost bin.
Thank you very much. Anybody else got a question?
Martyna, I'm really interested in that horticulture. Do you find that it attracts slugs a lot with all the wood that's there? And what's your view on you can get nematodes to kill off things like slugs and other weevils and things? What's your opinion on those?
Thanks. Horticulture, do you know what? I've basically found out that, slugs, I mean, being in West Yorkshire, this is like just non-stop. But I haven't found a much bigger kind of rise in them. I find slugs more when there's kind of big grassy areas, some kind of abandoned areas that, we've not managed to clear yet, i.e. my allotment, which is literally full of slugs. But I think the horticulture itself, it becomes a variety of things. So I haven't seen an increase in slugs in there, and certainly not in when I've put them in the polytunnels, because it's a bit warmer as well. So maybe that's where they kind of work a bit better. When it comes to nematodes, nemaslug, I use it myself. Well, when I can, I usually use it just in spring, because this is the time, you know, when we put little seedlings and you put 10 cabbages, it will take a slug, you know, half a day to go through them all. Whereas if these cabbages are now maybe 8 weeks old, they're changing the chemistry, they're a bit more bitter and tougher, so it's harder. So I usually use nemaslug when I plant out, together with beer traps and wool and whatever else I can, kind of hiding places and then, you know, executing them from there. But that, as it comes to nematodes, nemaslug, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I've looked, it doesn't affect any other life in soil. So I'm not sure how many other types of nematodes it kills. I know there's different types of nematodes for either slugs or vine weevils and thrips and so on. Not sure exactly which type of nematode it attacks, but it would be probably some sort of predatory ones. So I have not heard any concerns about it from any other kind of green gardeners I've come across yet.
Are we done? No other, yes.
Just wanted to ask you one question about, you're talking about the guy who says to, you know, cut crops off and leave the roots in the soil.
Mhm.
Brassicas, you know, you rotate brassicas because there's an issue of, you know, of getting club roots like that. How do you manage that risk if you're leaving the roots in the soil, potentially kind of residue in the bed?
So overall, as far as I know about healthy soil, like full of all these animals, because one of the things they do is they prevent pathogenic diseases in soil. So actually in their presence will probably break down a lot of this stuff. I think Charles Dowding rotates his beds still a little bit, but he's done tests where only by adding compost every year, and we're talking an inch or so, he's been adding a live compost every year to go into this bed, and he didn't found any diseases or anything that's reoccurring. It almost seems to me like, thinking about fermentation and gut and all of the bacteria, if your gut is full of every kind of beneficial microbes, you're less likely to actually catch a disease, you're less likely to go down with something. There's been, we had so many years of now testing of, immune system. Well, there would be times when my partner would get ill and I wouldn't. And, I had this actually thing because he was getting ill a lot and I was getting hardly any ill. And I truly believe it's because I was outside, I was eating a little bit better, I had my hands in soil. So, inside me was basically just so many different things that would just kind of, maybe if I had a cold, it would just be a day of sneezing and then it would go away, whereas normally it would put me down. So I think the similar correlation we're going to be finding in soil as well.
One more question, which is about mulching, because we were kind of always told traditionally that if you mulch with organic matter, as it decays, it will rob the soil of nitrogen. But I think that's not the case then.
So yeah, that is the case. So for example, if you mulch with straw, like people put strawberries, and then the strawberries go slightly light green because it robs the nitrogen, so the dark greenness from the leaves. I mulch with either sheep's wool, which basically just protects it. It's a nice summer mulch, and you can get it dead cheap for from farmers, because mostly they can't sell it now. So that's a layer of kind of protection and stuff. I use also waste hay bales, so like the big black bales in black plastic. I think sometimes if the water gets into them, and they rot and they're not good to use for animals anymore. And it's essentially just like wet, rotten straw, like kind of hair. So I use this a lot because it's kind of dark brown, and when you water it or it rains, it's got this nice light meadow hay straw color, nice thick texture. So anything that's been, because it's been already rotten down a bit, so that then goes into it. And I use wood chip as well. Ideally, you want to use, kind of older wood chip, but I haven't found much nitrogen robbing with fresh wood chip either. The only thing that you can put fresh that I know is comfrey. So comfrey leaves, you can mulch with that, kind of, they just dry off. But other than that, I would use something. So if I have a bag of straw, actually now at school, we have been given a bag of straw for mulching. I just put it in the bag, put water in it, put it in the sun. I'm going to let it break down for 2 weeks or 3. So it just kind of breaks down a little bit and then use it. So yeah, when it comes to mulching, you want to use something that's been a bit broken down, because yes, it will rob a little bit of nitrogen first. Same thing with biochar. You need to charge it before you put it, because otherwise it will rob nitrogen from the soil.
Hello, thank you very much for that. 15 years ago, I moved into a house that was on the site of an old mill, and the garden was terrible, and I became known as the mad slug lady, because I'd be out there and I had the head torch on, and there were so many slugs. I tried to break into. I've been doing what you've been saying now for about 15 years, and I can honestly say that I do not get slugs or much pathogen in the garden, and one of those reasons I think is birds as well. You know, I've obviously attracted birds, hedgehogs, all sorts of things that eat all this stuff. But how do we get around the problem of all the vested interests there are in continuing the use of all these products that are really seriously damaging the soil? Because you go into a garden centre and there's still, well, when you do a garden centre once, I looked down the road and every box had a kill. How do we get around that? How do we? Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to ask you about was green manures.
Okay, so how do we get around that? To be honest, you know, when we need to feed the soil, first thing is the compost. So your compost is going to be rich in everything. And when we compost, we can go to the extent of when you boil pasta, yeah, and you strain it into a pot, let it cool down, put it in, or potatoes maybe, yeah, put it in your compost. It's starch, it's some minerals there that potentially would just go down the drain. You know, compost your flowers, you know, compost a variety of different things. And then you're going to have a biodiverse kind of compost, so which will have everything your plants need. The stuff from the garden centers, honestly, go to the garden center and look at the most expensive rose feed, super blooms, amazing stuff. At the back of it, there'll be 3 numbers, NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And it will be like 5, 10, 30. So for great big blooms. The same NPK you can basically have for making comfrey tea. So if you think about what your plants need, they need macronutrients and micronutrients. So macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen you can get from horse manure, from nettles, from mowed grass, any kind of green foliage. So when you compost loads of green leaves, you deadhead your flowers, you mow your grass, you have lots of nitrogen there. Phosphorus, you can use wood ash, for example. So when you have a fire, you spread that ash on your beds. What is this phosphorus? There's something else that is rich in phosphorus. Potassium, comfrey, banana skins. So banana skins is an amazing fertilizer. You can actually treat your Christmas cactus to flower 2 months after it's stopped by submerging 3 banana skins in a jug of water, leaving it for 2 days to ferment, extract all this potassium from it, throw the banana skins in the compost, dilute that water with fresh water, water your flowers, water your tomatoes, they're going to have amazing blooms. So these are your macronutrients. And then the micronutrients like boron and all of these stuff, that will come from a variety from your compost. So most of the only thing I buy for the garden, if I do my own gardening, I buy a supplement from a company called EcoThrive, which is called Charge, and that's insect frass. So that's really phosphorus rich. So it's essentially insect mealworm poo, which are fed on organic carrots. And then if you, so that's one of the things I buy, and I buy a mycelium powder from a company called TNC, the nutrient company. It's called Micro, let's just change the name, Micro Plus, I think it's called. And it's a blend of like 18 mycorrhizal fungi and seaweed and protozoa and all sorts of different things. But when I plant my seedling, I dust the roots a little bit with it and then I plant it in. That helps the fungi to establish on the root of the plant and then join with the mycorrhizal web in the soil which already exists. And then if you feed your garden, you will have a really rich, diverse mycorrhizal system. So these are the two things I buy. When it comes to other nutrients, I just do a nettle tea for my nitrogen. I apply basically wood ash sometimes, and then I do comfrey tea, and that's literally it, and compost teas. And then you can play with compost teas. So if you think about, you want to do all of these things, so nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen you apply in spring, so when your green growth, when your plants are growing, when nettles are coming on, it's a time, you know, of new growth in spring. So we're going to get this time, we want to give them the boost. So nitrogen builds leaves, stems, healthy infrastructure for photosynthesis, the whole kind of plant structure. Phosphorus is responsible for roots, so it helps in developing healthy roots. It helps a little bit with flowering towards the end. Phosphorus is our bone meal, fish blood and bone. So that's what we apply in autumn for our perennial shrubs, fruits, because the tree is not producing leaves, it's just finished flowering, it's just knackered now. It needs some help to, you know, once dormant, to develop the roots. And then potassium is what flowers. So you then apply that when your flowers are about to bloom, when your tomatoes are setting fruit, you know. And nature is clever because you know, when you need to feed your roots, it's cold and you're making fire at home. Yeah, when you need to apply nitrogen, it's early spring and nettles are everywhere around. When you start growing your fruit, tomatoes and everything, comfrey is well up and flowering now. So these are really, you know, all of these minerals, that they are in things. So phosphorus is responsible for healthy roots. So what root vegetables we grow? We got carrots. So chop some carrots, or, you know, grate them, blend them, even smaller. The smaller things are, the easier to extend them. Make your compost tea, put carrots in it. Then, you know, do a test side by side. I've put, you know, this tea on this plant in this pot because it's just in a pot, and then this and then you compare the growth. So through playing and learning about what minerals are in what foods, because a lot of them we just have at home or growing, you know, next to us. We can actually collect. If you deadhead your flowers, you know, when you have a big flower border, when you deadhead your flowers, put them in a bucket, put some molasses in it, put some compost in it, bubble it up, or, you know, even anaerobic, ferment it on its own, you're going to extract lots of potassium from this waste, water your tomatoes with it. So a lot of these nutrients are basically available, and we just need to find a way to get them out. The hardest is silica. So some of them you need to buy, but this is like, you know, you don't need that, to be honest. And the other thing you said, what, green manures? Yeah, so that's kind of like cover crops, basically, worth growing. I've actually never managed to grow them myself because I've just been too busy. But from people who do grow them, it is definitely beneficial. Even if they just grow a bit and then they kind of die on the bed and cover it, that's still feeding the soil. One of the green manures that I recommend is buckwheat. So you can just grow some buckwheat near your beds or in pots. Buckwheat, when it flowers, it also attracts parasitic wasps called aphidius. So they are predating on aphids. So when you have problem with aphids, which probably all of us have now because it's dry, if you have buckwheat, predatory wasps, they're tiny, they look like tiny little, smaller than a fruit fly. When you start seeing them, Aphidius colemani they're called, you're going to start noticing them in the garden. They've got massive antennae comparing to the size. So when you grow plants which are attracting these guys, you know, there's many benefits to them. There might be a green manure and it will be attracting some predators, or it will feed the soil as well. So there's lots of correlations when it comes to plants. Plants are clever.
Thank you very much. I think we'll perhaps wind up there. Thank you so much, Martyna. Thank you for your time and all the fantastic tips that you've given us. So much to digest in all sorts of ways, I think. So as I said at the beginning, we have recorded this, so we will be putting that up, hopefully via the Hub's YouTube video, YouTube channel. As you're in Hampton Bridge, we hope to be able to connect with you again, Martyna. It'd be great to have an incredible edible settle, perhaps at some point. But as we have a lot of gardens, peat gardens, and a lot of ideas, lots to share between the two communities, for sure. So thank you for coming along today. Thank you everybody here for all of your questions. Just before we finish, and by all means, Martina, if you want to do, but just thank you once again.